As you can see, we are joined today live by Dr. Andrew Higgins and Dr. Dimitra Fimi, both with us here today after they've each given us so much wonderful information and insight into Tolkien's, both Tolkien's own invented languages and his own thoughts about language and language change and language development, which have been so interesting over the last couple of weeks. Today is our third session, and it's a much more open session. We want to definitely encourage people to be asking questions, making comments. If you've ever had questions about Tolkien's invented languages, you want to know something about Elvish, you're interested in his process and the role that it plays, that his languages and his language invention process plays in his in his creative life and everything. All of those kinds of things are all very much related to the topic under discussion today. You will never get a better occasion on which to ask these questions than today. So I certainly encourage you to do that. If you go to the chat window and type things in, the things you type it in there and hit enter. You won't see it pop up on the screen yourself, but we will see it. So that's how you can get your questions in. We are happy to talk about anything relevant to Tolkien's languages that you guys want to talk about here today. And again, as we've said before, you don't have to feel that you need to wait until they pause to ask for questions to type in your question. Just do it in advance, and they'll get in. See if you have a comment or some thought or input on something that's currently under discussion. Again, go ahead and just type that as you go, and we can work that in. And I would just want to remind you, as I have before, again, thanks so much to everyone who has given so generously to help to support this seminar and other seminars that we'll be doing throughout the year. That has been just wonderful. For those of you who haven't had a chance yet, you can still make a small suggested donation of $20 or $25 to help support this wonderful series, as we have big plans for the future seminars. We're going to do a wonderful series of Tolkien seminars throughout this year that we have coming for you. So your help and support is always, of course, greatly appreciated for that. So then, with no further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Andrew and Dimitra here, and I'll be back to sort of bring in some of your questions that I've gotten by email and things, and I'll be sort of helping out with that as we go. But thanks very much, both of you, again, for joining us.
There you go. It's good to be here again.
Hello, everyone.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Good evening. Well, I don't know. Good afternoon. Good evening, depending where in the world you are. I suppose it is quite late in the night here in Britain for us. I was just thinking, one little leftover thing that I wanted to begin with, really, this discussion, because it is supposed to be a discussion, but I didn't have to fit into my seminar last week. Was to actually try and, if we can, sort of imagine that moment or that time when Tolkien gave that talk in Pembroke College all of those years ago, because actually this is exactly 80 years from that day, actually, when that talk was given. And I think, in terms of how really important thinkers of their times, professors like Tolkien, who clearly was very much ahead of his time in a number of ideas like that phonetic symbolism notions that I was talking about last week, who is actually experimenting with creating a fictional language that is as detailed as international auxiliary languages like Esperanto or something like this. How, a great mind like that sort of presents these pretty out there ideas to a very small group of undergraduates who have, who happens to be in their college. And I find that extraordinary. I don't think, that sort of thing would happen in that context nowadays. We have many more universities, greater numbers of students, not this sort of small group engagement as it would have been at the time. And I suppose, in Tolkien's time, there were also professors that were sort of celebrities and wouldn't quite go anywhere. But Tolkien, of course, at that point was not, but he was soon to become one. And to share his language creation, that for him was something very close to his heart, something that he was clearly sort of worried about to do. He was a bit reticent to reveal, that passion, that secret vice, exactly what the phrase is saying. To share this with such an audience is, I think, a remarkable thing. These are all much younger people, probably a bit more eager, a bit more keen, a bit less a bit less ready to actually mock, possibly, or take the mick out of this activity. There is this sort of power relationship there. He's much older than them and much more senior in terms of his academic expertise. But to share all of this and to actually read poetry aloud in his invented languages is quite extraordinary, and I think that's something that we should acknowledge. The revolutionary sort of nature of that talk, of that delivery, is something that is quite important. And I remember when I was going to Pembroke to sorry, Andy, have interrupted you. Wanted to add something? When I went to Pembroke.
You go ahead.
Sorry, we have we have a bit of a delay between our two videos, so this is going to happen a lot. But there we go. When I went to Pembroke to sort of look through all of the rest of the minutes and see what else we can find out about the Johnson Society, and of course Tolkien had been invited in their dinners. There are actually in existence a few menu cards with his signature. There are minutes where he's the society are thinking about who shall we invite. Should it be sort of Collingwood, another very important academic at the time, or should it be Tolkien? And this is what sort of was quite striking when I walked into Pembroke was the moment I had to go through a side door because they were sort of doing works, and the main door of the college was blocked with sort of restoration work at that point. So I had to use a side door, and it was really uncanny. But I turned around, through that little door, through that little corridor, and there was the portrait of Samuel Johnson, the historical sort of linguistic figure whose name the society had. And there was something a bit uncanny about that. This is the same college that Johnson was associated with, and here is Tolkien later on, sort of carrying, in a way, the legacy of some very important people of the 18th century who are involved with progressive linguistic ideas or radical linguistic ideas. Yeah. Sorry, Andy, over to you. What did you want to add?
I was just going to comment on that. And what amazed me is when we found those minutes, and we also found the list of other papers that were given at the society, and the breadth of the topics, everything from Samuel Johnson, but also other poets. There was one on King Arthur, I remember. I mean, it was quite broad, and you can almost see these professors using this type of society to try out some new material, as it were, And I think that's what Tolkien was partially doing. He said, okay, well, these are students, so let me try this stuff out on them. And like you said, they would be more welcoming, I think, definitely. But I was amazed, and I think we say it somewhere in the book, that it had become almost like a student society in many ways. It was a junior common room thing. Yeah.
So in sort of officially it was a literary society, but in reality all sorts of topics were covered. So there was a paper on Lawrence of Arabia, for example, or historical figures. Some important sort of I can't remember the name now. An important journalist of the 19th century. Figures like that. So as you say, it was a forum for a wide range of topics to be covered. So in a way, if you think about it that way, it's not that strange that Tolkien decides, to talk about I think it's fair to say a wacky topic in a context or in a forum like that. Mm.
And also, I think there was a paper given on Jonathan Swift and Thomas More, two language inventors as well. So, there was definitely some other language invention ideas going on there as well. So,
Yeah, I actually have a sort of a follow-up from that, and Dimitra, it sort of picks up on the the emphasis that you were laying on the title of the talk, right? Especially because they're sort of the two halves of it, right? There's the secrecy of it, and then there's the vice, right? The sort of the characterization of it as a vice. And of course, if you accept that it's a vice, then the fact that you would keep it secret is, of course, perfectly understandable. But I've always sort of wondered, and especially I've just been thinking about this more in the last few minutes as you've been discussing, especially in this context, right? This context with this kind of a student group and this kind of a, because it's sort of an interesting combination, right? It's, on the one hand, it's a public presentation, but it's not quite a public presentation. It's also a private. I mean, they were meeting in the rooms of a professor, so it's not like he's on a street corner. It's not like he's publishing, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like it was open to the public exactly, but it's not private either. And so, anyway, it's just the tone. What exactly do you make of the tone of his use of the word vice in characterizing this? I mean, that is to say, because, one could easily imagine this being something he's very actively shy about, right? Like that there's some level on which he actually feels that it's something, if not to be ashamed of, then to be embarrassed about. Or, or was this kind of, not exactly false humility, but a kind of a humility topos thing, right? Like, I don't want to make a big deal of this. I'm not trying to say that I'm a genius or anything, that I make up all of my own languages, but, that is, do you see what I mean? I just sort of wonder, especially thinking about the talk in this context, and just thinking of all those physical artifacts, with the menu cards and things, just imagining him in that place with these people giving this talk. How do you understand his use of the word vice?
Oh my goodness. Where do we start with? I'll have a go, and then and if you want to come in. First of all, there was, for us, a question of whether that was actually the title of the talk, because in the manuscript we actually have the title "A Hobby for the Home." That's all you get, on that piece of paper, in pencil as well. So the clearest sort of handwriting there. So there is no title, A Secret Vice. But we know, of course, and that's what Christopher Tolkien assumed and surmised, very correctly, that because in a later letter he referred to that talk as A Secret Vice, that's what he should call. And of course, the words A Secret Vice occur in the talk itself. So for us, it was actually, for a while, we were thinking, what are we going to call this thing? Tolkien himself, in his handwriting, he's written on that folder, A Hobby for the Home. But then, again, the minutes. Do you see the importance of those, as you say, those artifacts, those particular documents? The minutes themselves said that this was the title of the topic, as the title of the essay as it was given, the title of the paper as it was given. So, they talk about Professor Tolkien gave an extraordinary talk called A Secret Vice, and the Secret Vice was revealed to be, so clearly the students were quite intrigued by this. I think it was designed to be quite intriguing. Okay, as you say, in that sort of semi-safe environment, not in a big lecture theatre of 100 students or in front of many of his peers. I mean, there would have been some of the other professors there, but not really anybody he wouldn't trust. He refers to McCallum, as I was saying last week. But in that sort of environment, it's okay to be a bit playful, I think, with language, and we see that element of Tolkien, sort of using language to entice speakers there. I bet, if you saw Professor so-and-so is going to give a talk about A Secret Vice, you think, oh gosh, what is he going to talk about? It really does excite the interest there. And of course,
sort of all of these speculations. It's like the question of which closet exactly is he going to come out of, in that talk, right?
A modern equivalent would be if a professor gave said they were going to give a lecture on the fear of flying, for example. Obviously that title having an enticing thing because of the Erica John, and then you get there and it's really about, being afraid of flying. But it's to get them into the room, basically, with that kind of enticing kind of thing. And I also think, and we see it several times with Tolkien, that kind of self-deprecating. I go back to when he wrote to Edith in that, letter in 1914, I've done some more work on my nonsense fairy language. He's putting it down, but I think in a way he really values it. But he's looking at it from the perspective, I think, of what people would look at it from the outside. I mean, I invent languages. I create languages. I'm conlanging. I'm doing that right now. And if I tried to explain that to someone, let's say the cleaner at Glyndebourne, they'd probably think I was nuts, you know. So I'd be like, oh yeah, it's a stupid thing I do, and blah 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 blah. But I really value it, you know. So it's kind of a protective shell you put on these things that you think other people are going to think are weird, you know, by saying, oh yeah, it's nothing, it's just a small thing I do, basically. You know, even in the Wallman letter when he says absurd at the end, you know, he does that whole thing and then he goes absurd, you know. I think it's the same type of thing. It's kind of a way to deflect nerdiness from people who don't understand the nerdiness, maybe.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
Mm.
Right.
I
Yeah.
can see a few sort of follow-up things on the discussion box there. So Timothy is saying there that relating to that question, just how respectable was language invention at the time, and did anyone really study Swift and the others from this standpoint? Right, no, that's a good question. My answer to that would come from the international auxiliary languages. For sure, language invention is in the air at that time, but not necessarily language invention for fiction. I would think that the more, you know, as I was saying last week, you know, the Esperanto Congress just before, you know, all of the Esperanto activity of McCallum and other people from Pembroke College, all of this is definitely very much in the public attention. There are still at this point consortia of linguists who are sitting down trying to invent the perfect sort of universal language, the perfect international language for communication. Although, again, ironically, while there is still this thing going on, there is also slowly a route towards decline, because the one event that shook, you know, all of these hope and aspirations of the international language movement was the Great War. You know, all of this hope for humanity all together, you know, united, sort of humanism, etc. Well, the Great War sort of, you know, after that, a lot of these ideas sort of disappeared, were shattered, you know, together with all of those, I suppose, you know, men and their bodies really in this war. You know, if we're going to be lyrical about it, a lot of ideas, a lot of beliefs, a lot of ambitions were shattered during that time. So Tolkien, very interestingly, is writing all of this at a period where there is this tail end of this very strong movement and still around, but it's very much, you know, towards its end, towards its decline. And we don't really see another big flowering until we get languages for fiction later, actually, with people like Orwell and come on, Clockwork Orange. I'm sorry, brain isn't working at the moment. And much later, then again with science fiction, with Klingon, etc. So there is this sort of lull for a while. Yeah, in terms of, and do you want to come in terms of Swift and
I would also say up to Tolkien, you know, invented languages for fiction were very much just an appendage, you know, that kind of came out of the New Romance movement, this idea of trying to create a world and using language as just one element. But if you look at a lot of, if you take, for example, something like Edward Bulwer Lytton's Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, you know, he invents elements of a language. There's a whole chapter in the book, in the fictional book, which is essentially a traveler's tale of someone going underground and encountering these strange people. But the language isn't integrated into the text at all. It's just kind of in a, you know, chapter 5 on grammar, basically. And it's just like you would create a map, you would do this to invent a world. You know, that language isn't up to the time of Tolkien, basically. It's not integrated. And I also think it's interesting that I know he makes that little comment about I've done some research, but he doesn't mention any real invented languages for fiction. He talks more about the ones he's been involved with, like Anna Malik and Ned Bosch. But we now know, of course, he's interested in Swift because he's got the notes in there about Swift and things like that, and with Fun Legion. But he doesn't talk about Thomas More. He doesn't talk about Edward Bulwer Lytton, Percy Gregg, you know, even Edgar Rice Burroughs, who created Barsoomian for the John Carter of Mars series, which you would have seen. They came out in 1912. So he doesn't mention any of that, which is, I find that interesting. Yeah. And talking about world building. No, I was just,
yes,
I was going to say, I mean, I was just going to say about world building, you know, the language then starts to become mixed into the other elements of world building, like map making. And there was a fantastic show on TV last night here in the UK about fantasy that I know Dimitri was involved with. And it talked a lot about the integration of world building in terms of maps and language and geology, all that coming together. And I think a lot of that is the heritage of Tolkien, basically. That's what Tolkien did. So we don't see that before, pretty much before Tolkien, but that's kind of his legacy. I gave a plug to that show because I thought
Alexander
it was so
Way is making a very good point here. Okay, yeah, Alexander Way is making a good point here about this embarrassment that we were talking about before. This sort of, yeah, I want to talk about it, but I don't really want to talk about it. But, you know, will people care about it? You know, I don't want to sort of expose my heart here, and at the same time, I'm pretty aware that not everyone will think that this is a great thing. But Alexander is saying quite rightly that the embarrassment here matches with Live by Niggle. Very much so. He thought of his obsessions as niggling, not very important, somewhat embarrassing. And that is actually, yes, of course, we can see this as part of the larger picture of Tolkien the academic, who's expected to be doing serious academic work, you know, editing medieval manuscripts, you know, really publishing his lectures, and being there, sort of producing excellent scholarship. And instead, he sort of somewhere hiding in his garage, sort of building this world and telling these stories, and, you know, to make it even weirder, creating languages for those people. So yes, I think there is definitely, you know, if we read it by Niggle metaphorically, it very much feels like this is part of the tree. You know, this is part of the tree that he feels that other people don't understand. You know, they won't get it. Definitely. Let me see. There's a couple of more questions that I can see.
I'm not seeing the question box for some reason. Can you see?
Yes, I can see a question from Marie here, who's saying, sorry, this is a new interface for Andy and me, so we're doing our best here, but bear with us. Marie saying, this essay is contemporaneous with Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos stories, correct? He focused on Swift, but would his critique of all the X's and Z's be aimed at Lovecraft? Lovecraft himself, Marie says, is a bit Swift-like. That's an interesting question.
Interesting. I mean, Lovecraft would have been 30s and 40s, definitely. And he, of course, Lovecraft, he's actually interesting because he invented a language that he didn't even have to invent any words for, just mentioning the language called Aklo. And Aklo is so demonic that you're not allowed to speak it, because if you do, the demons of Cthulhu come up and destroy you. So he just mentions Aklo. And there's two other languages that he creates little bits of. But there's not a lot of grammar with Lovecraft. There's that one line in Cthulhu Cathong in the Cthulhu mystery. But I think it's interesting. I mean, that's fascinating, because one of the things, of course, Tolkien talks about in that passage about, you know, the words don't have to sound, they don't have to look foreign, they don't have to have lots of X's and Z's and things like that in it. And in a way, that's what Lovecraft does with that line about Cthulhu Mathon and all that and everything. It looks weird, yeah. But possibly, yeah.
I also have a question here about Wilkins' philosophical language and whether Tolkien would have known about it. As far as I know, there is no specific reference of Wilkins' language. But in my book, in my first book, Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, I discussed that I sort of claimed that it must have at least Lodwig's universal output. And Lodwig is very much contemporary with Wilkins, because the way that and actually this is the pasigraphy, the written code rather than the spoken language, because the way that the Tengwa, letters, you know, the writing system with particular roots of letters and then stems and then things moving around and then expressing particular voiced, voiceless, fricatives, etc. So it feels like there is a synergy there. That was first actually noted by Alan in that lovely book, you know, An Introduction to Elvish. But I sort of looked further into how Tolkien would have known about Lodwig and those sort of thinkers of that century, and it's not, you know, it was possible. There were people working on the 18th century and these particular authors at the time. So yeah, it's I don't have any direct evidence for Wilkins, but I wouldn't be surprised. I think Lodwick is a clearer example because of this correlation. Yeah. Timothy Fisher is saying, is there any indication that Tolkien was looking for converts to language creation? Timothy, do you mean here that was he looking to recruit people to? I suppose it's a fair question, especially when he keeps on saying that we should declare it as this new form of art. You know, one day it'll be recognized. One day there will be museums about this sort of thing. You know, you see some wishful thinking going on there. I don't know. The talk itself gave much indication of that. But as I was saying last week, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall and listened to that discussion that happened afterwards, because goodness knows, you know, what sort of topics came up. You know, we only have a very quick, just a couple of lines in the minutes about what sort of things they discussed. As they say, and we all continued discussing until late at night, you know, in so-and-so, Mr. So-and-so's rooms, and you're thinking, gosh, you know, goodness knows. Yeah, I think that's more of a speculative one.
There's an interesting kind of dichotomy in the talk too, because he does say, you know, this is all secret and kept in drawers, but they deserve to be shown and heard and things like that, and there should be an academy of people, you know. So he's almost contradicting himself a bit. He says they're all secret and they're done in secret, but they deserve to be heard, you know. So he's acknowledging also that there are other ones out there as well, basically, but because they're so shy, they keep them in their drawers and they never show them. So maybe he's saying to people, if you do this, you know, come out, let's let's take a look at it or something possible.
Yeah. Wesley is also asking a good question. Where would playfulness fit into the communication/art spectrum? Is that a part of Tolkien's middle way, you know, secret vice, a kind of serious playfulness? Yeah, that's a good question there, Wesley. If you think about sort of what James Joyce is doing with language, for example, you know, we talk about him as a pretty serious artist, you know, very much seen as a revolutionary, avant-garde, you know, polyglot, neologisms there, a number of different languages, a number of different references to artificial languages, etc. But at the end of the day, you know, Joyce very much relies on humor. You know, a lot of this play with language is a humorous play with language, and he seems to also be making the point that that's fine, that's art as well. You know, that's allowed. That's allowed too. And of course, one of the earliest practitioners of this sort of technique of using maybe not a coherent made-up language, but sort of jumbling language to create an effect like potentially sound symbolism would be Lewis Carroll and Jabberwocky, and that again is supposed to be comical, isn't it? So I think there is something here about there is an idea here that humor is okay, you know, that being playful is also, you know, can also be artistic. Definitely, that's my sort of personal reaction to that.
I think another interesting person who used language and didn't exactly invent language, but played with language in an interesting way was the poet Edward Lear. And Lear used limericks a lot. I mean, he actually did. If you read his limericks, they are also kind of inventing a fantasy world of his own. But I think it's interesting that Tolkien uses the limerick form in the Nevbosh limerick, you know, the one about the cow and everything. And is he in some way mirroring the kind of the comic playfulness of Edward Lear and his limericks?
Yeah, I mean, Andy, you were the one who had noticed that there is even you know, he seems to be replicating in a funny way, or at least the opening on one of Lear's limericks there. So it seems like this is a bit more conscious than it might seem at the beginning. Definitely, yeah. There was an old man. There was a cow.
An old man with a cow. Yeah, exactly. That's found in Lear.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see.
I have a quick follow-up question.
Yep.
Okay, actually, that's a lie. I have a long follow-up question, or rather, not one that's simple to answer. Because of course, thinking about this, again, imagining Tolkien presenting this and kind of the place where he was, both literally in 1931, and the sort of the more abstractly understood, the kind of place in the development of his ideas and his linguistic ideas that he was in 1931. I'm, of course, thinking about where he was a few years later, right? As I know Andy knows, we just did in the Mythgard Academy series, we just did The Lost Road. And so, I've been thinking a lot about the Llamas and the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion and all that kind of stuff. So, 6 years, right? 6 years after he delivers this talk, here he is packaging up his Elvish languages for publication, right? In the Llamas, and of course he's doing it in the Llamas within a fictional frame, right? So there's kind of a layer of insulation between himself and it in some sense. I mean, obviously the Llamas is a much less personal revelation, or confession than the Secret Vice lecture is. But clearly, I mean, this is, now talk about, going from confessing his secret vice, behind closed doors, right, in the chambers of one of his colleagues to a closed group of students, to now at least imagining, of course, fruitlessly as it turned out, but imagining that he's going to be publishing this stuff. Just so my kind of vague question thinking about that is, where do you feel sort of was happening with Tolkien? Like, can you kind of, like, over the course of the 30s, how do you get from one to the next? Or what do you think was going on, with Tolkien in his mind and his sort of his thought about his own languages and the status of his language development and where he was going? I would love to hear you guys just kind of talk about that moment or that development in Tolkien's own thinking.
Should I try that one, Dimitra? I've actually been giving this a lot of thought because I'm working on a paper for a conference next year, and that's just what I want to look at. I want to look at the period from the time he gave the Secret Vice to the Llamas and the etymologies, because I think it's interesting, and I know Dimitra and I discussed this while we were writing the book too. There's a sense that after his Secret Vice, there's this explosion of development of the Elvish languages, not just for the Quenya and the Noldoran, which are the two that he quotes in the Secret Vice. He gives the 3 Quenya poems or Quenya poems, and then he gives the one untitled Noldoran poem about Luthien and everything, which we have in the book. But he also, as he's expanding the mythology, as we saw in The Lost Road, he's also expanding the number of different types of Elvish languages. So you start to get all kinds of dialects like Ilkoran and Dani and Ossiariendic and things like that. And I think that is coming from, I would say, the confidence of giving that Secret Vice talk and kind of the receptions that he got for it, basically. And he's thinking, okay, well, they didn't boo me out of the room. They didn't, they actually, as we know, we don't know exactly what happened afterwards, but clearly, given the minutes, this was a very well-received paper. So that might have given him the confidence to say, all right, well, let me work on this, and not just work on the 2 Elvish languages, but think about, as my mythology starts to develop of the Elvish history, it also will expand into different things. And he's playing around with a lot in the 1930s, looking at the papers we now have, with all kinds of different comparative tables, how words shift in different languages. We don't see that as before. So that, I think, is kind of the heritage of the Secret Vice, and the end part of that is the Llamas and the etymologies, I think.
And I think, sorry, I think I've lost my connection. Oh no, you can still see me. Sorry, for a moment I thought I lost my connection. I think it's also important in that respect to think about the Secret Vice as a companion document, as a companion piece to On Fairy Stories. There are some of the ideas that are there towards the end of a Secret Vice about, the freedom of the adjective, all of these elements about not the invented languages, but language more generally, and its capacity for fantasy, for me is a bit of a preamble for On Fairy Stories. But in a way, if you take the two together, we could be talking about the 2 manifestos of Tolkien's art here. Secret Vice sort of really delineating the role of language, of invented languages in his legendarium, and On Fairy Stories justifying, the art of fantasy, the art of creating fantasy as something worthy, as something within a literary tradition, within a canon, and as, and I completely agree with Andy here that as Dag Anderson and Verling Flieger, I think quite clearly showed that after on fairy stories, Tolkien sort of sets off and with a new confidence to compose some of the best known works of the legendarium, really. In the same way as Andy was saying, there is this blooming, this blossoming of linguistic invention than there was before after A Secret Vice. So there is this element of self-reflection that I really like about this essay. This sort of I'm sort of clearing up some things in my own mind by presenting them to other people as a sort of reaching a certain milestone about his own thinking of this art, you know, this sort of forgotten art, as he calls it, and then launching onto the next project with a much clearer mind and a much more clear rationale, at least, you know, in his mind about the importance of this task.
And I think there's an interesting bookmark with the mythology is language and language is mythology, which you get in both talks, basically. And in between those two talks, there's all of this work on both myth and language combined together in the Elvish history.
Yeah, absolutely. Alexander has a nice little thing to add here. He says, I wonder whether he thought he could confess his vice and be absolved. Well, that's that's an interesting way of looking at it, especially from somebody who was about Roman Catholic and was certainly going to confession. You know, is there a play here with this idea of, okay, I know I shouldn't be doing this, you know, it's too much sort of time spent on this. He says that in the essay a couple of times, doesn't he? Too much wasted time, you know, too many times you sort of stolen away from other things that I should be doing. Maybe that's a way to sort of say, well, look, I told people about it. It wasn't, I wasn't completely secretive about this. Yeah, I like this idea. I like this sort of metaphorical reading of it. Okay.
So I have a very specific question that came in by email from Sean Marchese, and Andy, I think it's primarily for you because he's thinking about the word Fonway in particular in Fonwegian, trying to understand that word or trying to figure out how that word could be under. And well, I won't read the entire email because it's quite long, but but basically he's sort of both doing some work to try to think about, you know, could this be, you know, derivable and, you know, can the word Fonway be understood in some way from within Tolkien's own invented languages? You know, looking at other, you know, Fon and For and thing, you know, like, you know, and stuff, or, you know, is there some other incompatible possibility of this being derived from other languages, like, you know, you had sort of talked about Fon Logos, right? And, you know, how that seems like it could be connected to Greek, and, you know, so it's, you know, so anyway, it's just, what are your thoughts about that? Do you have any further ideas about the word Fonway?
God, I've been thinking about. I don't think there's a day that goes by when I don't think about what Fonway is. I mean, I think there's still something about Norway, Norwegian, Fonway, Fonwegian. I think there's something interesting that those two parallels, although there is nothing in the language that we have that has any sense of Norway or Norwegian. I did go through all of the Quenya base. I went through all the base roots. I went through all the Goldegrin. I went through all the etymologies to try to find, could Fon, you know how Tolkien had that habit of starting something in one of the earlier languages and then bringing him into later languages, like we have with Ru. You know, in Nafrin, we have this word Ru, which means always, ever. And then that comes into Quenya as Voro, which becomes Varanwe, the steadfast one, Ariendel's wife and then companion. And I was thinking maybe he did that with Fon. Maybe there's something in Fon that you can see. And I can't see. I mean, the only thing, again, there's the thing in the Rebus poem that I talked about, you know, the Chief Fongi dances. And there's this invented language by this guy named George Salamazar about on Formosa, which is an island. But that's it. I can't. There's been some interesting discussion on the Lord of the Rings Fanatics Plaza, I think it is, about some of the real philological elements of Secret Vice and Fonway. And people are trying, and that's great because that's why we wanted this information out there. But I can't think of any other link to it right now. I wish I could. If I could get Tolkien in a room for 5 minutes, I would just say, "What were you doing with this Swanway thing?" But no. Any ideas out there?
That would be interesting to know. To be honest, it was, it was one of those moments where, when Andy sort of found that slip of paper, we were looking at each other and thinking, I mean, are we imagining this? Is that even is that even an F? Are we seeing, is that a different word that we're seeing here? And again, this is in one of those cases where the minutes really helped because it was quite clearly written with an F. So, however bad the handwriting is there, however much the pencil isn't very sharp, could it be something else? We did think a lot about it. And in a way, when the minutes were found, it was a validation that at least we got the right word. But that is, one of the reasons why it's been so difficult. Yeah. Alexander's saying here that what about Ingwe and Finwe? As elements.
Well, Finway, the name Finway comes from what I remember, comes from a Proto-Eldarin root Fin, Phin. So I don't, and I did look for fawns with PH, but I didn't see anything. And that means man anyway. I think that the Fin comes from the root that has something to do with man or fear. I'd have to look it up again, but possibly, but no, I don't know.
I think this is one we're going to have to just leave there for the moment. And the more people are involved and look, the better chances they're going to be. Oh, goodness knows, it might be that we find, more supporting sort of evidence for this. It might be that we find more material. Goodness knows. Before we started all this project, this wasn't widely known very much. So, yeah, who knows? Maybe we will find out at some point.
I think that's an interesting point, and something would be great to get some views on is, what kind of things have people gotten excited about in terms of the book, in terms of what they want to work on, and so maybe do some research on, and what ideas has it sparked and things like that. Because the great thing about every one of these books coming out is it gives us lots more information to kind of ponder and analyze and stuff like that. So it'd be great to hear from you guys how, what you found interesting and you're going to be working on in papers and books and all that.
And just to say that for the last couple of years, I've been organizing Tolkien sessions at Leeds, the International Medieval Congress at Leeds, which has been happening since the early 90s, really. It's had quite a long run as a convention, not as long as Kalamazoo, which is in its 50th year, but it's a long-established conference on medieval studies in Britain, and fingers crossed if my sessions are accepted for 2017. That's going to be the third year. But we did have a roundtable discussion on new Tolkien, in which we had Kullervo papers and Secret Vice papers. And one thing that actually Brad Eden did a brilliant paper on, actually bringing together in a very, very interesting way Kullervo and a Secret Vice, is the mention of music in both of them. And of course, a Secret Vice is all about language and linguistic invention, but this is Tolkien, so we're talking about aesthetics as well. We're talking about euphony, and remember all of those little extracts I was reading to you last week about language as music. The sound does it. The sound does it. This sense of, of the human mouth, the oral cavity as a musical instrument. There's a lot of references to musicality, to music, which again, funnily enough, isn't that far away from what Stein was trying to do with sort of divorcing the sound and meaning and just playing it as music. So yes, that, I think for me, that is an area that will hopefully yield more research and more thought, because of course music is a theme that seems to be nearly everywhere in Tolkien's writings. He seems to be using music as a metaphor. At times he's using music as a sort of cosmic ingredient, of course, with an Einmühlendale and the creation of air. So that is quite exciting. That was quite an exciting thing for me to hear, of scholars already, making these connections and using material from this book to further, our understandings of Tolkien more generally. So yeah, that was great to see.
Yes, well, I hope that people will even just here during the rest of the session, if you guys who are attending have any thoughts or ideas of, things that you find yourself curious about now, hearing more about this and thinking more about this, of directions you think that inquiry could go, that'd be really fun to discuss. I also just wanted to hear. In the book, you guys talk a little bit about the reception and legacy of Tolkien's invented languages, and that's something that has kind of come up a little bit. But I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, to talk a little bit about the reception of Tolkien's languages is fascinating. I mean, there's a history there basically of how they were received, and I recommend there's a brilliant article by Carl Hofstetter, who is the wizard of Tolkien linguistics, certainly the man whose soldiers I work off of. And he wrote a great article for one of the Tolkien studies called 50 Years of Tolkienian Linguistics. And what he did in that article is broke down the different phases of when people first encountered the languages in the books, in the Lord of the Rings. So you think back to when the first time someone saw Elvish would have been in the Fellowship of the Ring. It would have been when the elves, when the hobbits encountered Gildor and Glorion, in Crickhollow, and they heard that first line of Elvish with the Elbereth and things like that. And what people started doing is people who were interested in this started just literally collecting all the different things and trying to figure out how the grammar worked and everything. And of course, at this time, Tolkien was, still living, of course, so people started sending Tolkien letters. And we have some people like Naomi Mitchison, who actually saw an advanced copy of the Fellowship of the Ring and was able to send Tolkien questions about the language. And Tolkien, being Tolkien, wrote back long explanations. And of course, we have a lot of these now in the letters of Tolkien. So you start to get this back and forth with Tolkien on some key linguistic things. And of course, he's drawing all this from all the language papers, which we now have, basically. Tolkien actually, when he finished writing The Lord of the Rings, he did have in mind to write a kind of a book about Elvish philology, and he started compiling every word in The Lord of the Rings, every foreign word, Elvish, Dwarfish, whatever. And this has been published now in Parma, Eldolem Barnes 17. So you can go through and see every Elvish or Dwarvish word and see what Tolkien thought about it philologically and the roots and stuff like that. So you have this period where there's a lot of communication with Tolkien doing that. And then after the books came out, people also started to try to figure out what Tolkien's languages were all about. And you have this group of people that Carl calls the decoders. And these are people who started looking at the words and saying, aha, well, Sauron must come from the Anglo-Saxon word meaning sour, meaning sickness, and things like that. Tolkien hated this. And there's a very good letter in letters that he drafted to a Mr. Rang, never sent it, where he basically goes through and debunks this whole theory. And he says essentially that if a word has some essence of sounding something like a primary language, that essence stopped until it was fit into my mythology. So in other words, even though it sounds like it may be from the primary world, when it was fitted into my mythology, it had its own meaning. So you have these people who try to decode the languages. And then you really have this group of people that study Tolkien's language from a very philological perspective. And Dimitra mentioned probably the Bible of that period, and that was Jim Allen's Introduction to Elvish, which used a very philological approach to understand Tolkien's languages, and also not to do what people have tried to do more recently, and that is try to conflate all the different versions of the languages together. Because the thing to remember with Tolkien and language is there is no one Elvish. There are many, many, many versions of Elvish dependent on his own linguistic, what he was interested in linguistically and shifting ideas in his own mind. So some people tried to conflate those all together and almost create an Elvish language that you could speak and use for your tattoos and things like that. And there's a book by Ruth Knoll called The Languages of Middle-earth, which really tries to do that. And then Jim Allen tried to really think of it from a philological perspective. So you have these two kind of camps growing up, basically. One who really tried to describe it from a philological perspective, the other ones who tried to, almost like an auxiliary language, use it to communicate, basically. And of course, what happens there, for anyone who's worked on Tolkien's languages, is you immediately start making up things that Tolkien did not invent to solve problems in terms of translation. And I myself, when I was young, tried to do this by translating Shadow of the Past into Sindarin. And I was making up words as I was going along. So, I've learned not to do that. But what was great about this is people were really engaging with Tolkien's languages. And then with the rise of the internet, of course, you had this great explosion in terms of how people were using the languages. And to this day, I would say there are still those two kind of camps. There are the people who want to study Tolkien's languages from a philological, historical perspective, looking at the different layers of Tolkien's languages and trying to understand what he was doing in that conceptual period. And then you have a group of people that use Tolkien's languages as the basis to create a language that can be used to translate stuff into, Quenya or Sindarin. There's even stuff called Neo-Quenya, Neo-Sindarin now, where people, try to translate books of the Bible into it and stuff like that. Both have interesting merits, but of course, I think the philological perspective is working on the languages Tolkien created. The other perspective is using Tolkien's languages to create something more like an auxiliary language to communicate.
Yeah, I suppose it's the difference between critical study and reception studies, really, isn't it? And as long as this distinction is clear, as you say, both of them have merits. But it depends, what is your aim at the end of the day. Reception studies is an interesting one that a lot of work on Tolkien has been done on reception, especially adaptations of Tolkien's, a lot on fan fiction, etc. And as long as we're clear that Tolkien's writing was, of course, fluid, changed quite a lot. There is no homogeneous language that you can take off the shelf as it is and use it, then that's fine, as long as this distinction is there. Yeah.
And of course, this changes later on when the language invention that happens after Tolkien, very much in Tolkien's shadow. You start to have linguists themselves who invent the language. So if you look at Klingon, for example, Mark Orkran was hired by the director of Star Trek III: The Search for Spock to invent the language of Klingon. There had been elements of it before, just made up, basically. But in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, Orkran came in and created a grammar, he created a vocabulary, and again, even there, we talk about reception, the fans took that and built upon that now. And Klingon, as Erika or Kren says in her book, has almost become like an auxiliary language. Dothraki is another example. David Peterson was hired by the directors of the Game of Thrones series to invent Dothraki, which is mentioned in Martin's books, and there's about 50 words. But Peterson won this award, basically, to invent the Dothraki and then later the High Valyrian languages. So in those cases, you have languages that are very much definitely developed by linguists, and there's only one version of it because it's a homogeneous thing. Whereas Tolkien was about process and he was about language development. And so that's why you have many different versions of it.
And he was a niggler, he wasn't easily satisfied. He wasn't easily satisfied with anything, and he didn't have a deadline. You see what I mean? So, he could keep on perfecting, perfecting, and changing his mind. And at times, the Legendarium hadn't been published either. The vast body of the mythology hadn't been published. So as long as he could change, bits of the story, the development of the languages, all the other way around, it was all still very exciting and very, very creative, wasn't it? Yeah. There's a couple of questions that I'm seeing here. Sorry, I am sort of plodding through those. From Phil Knight. Do you think the devaluation, for want of a better term, of words, just in the last webinar, for example, Gertrude Stein, had its parallels in the kind of thing Tolkien was talking about in his poem Mythopoeia, the meaning of words like a star, etc. Right, so I presume, Phil, you're talking here about the fragmentation of meaning and the fragmentation of the unity of word and meaning. I think this is much more squarely in the field of Owen Barfield, and of course Gertrude Stein is talking about the excitedness, that original freshness of the word, which is lost when it's becoming overused and trite and overfamiliar. But the more mystical element here, I think it's straight out of Barfield, and his idea of the original unity of meaning, and how this is slowly sort of becomes fragmented and of course, the major study on this is by Verlin Flieger in Splintered Light. But for me, again, that was a big, exciting moment in this project when we saw mentions of Barfield again in that essay on phonetic symbolism. And Tolkien is saying that only certain classes of words are susceptible for study in terms of phonetic symbolism, of sound symbolism. Not only especially those that are poetic, but probably the reason why they are. And says C.F. Barfield. So somehow poetic words have this, or maybe retain that potential, retain this this magic, this unity of sound and meaning on a level that we just grasp, intuitively. We might not quite get it in a sense of, in a very literal or conscious sense. It's sort of unconsciously there. But Barfield was a nice surprise, really, to be mentioned again, because Barfield did, of course, publish about the idea of sound symbolism, but much later, not until a couple of decades later, actually. So clearly, this is something that they were discussing, between them. There's a little mention in Poetic Diction about the relationship between sound and meaning, but he sort of says, I can't really go into that, it's too big a topic, and he leaves it aside. As I said, he mentions it in a much later publication than A Secret Vice. But clearly, in their discussions, those Inklings meetings, there must have been some talk for him to reference Barfield, really, here in this particular essay on phonetic symbolism, for sure. Yeah. Wesley saying, I would still like to hear more about Tolkien's process of learning, researching and teaching this too. If he started his Old English class by reciting the opening of Beowulf, he held up the music first, but then he was clearly dedicated as a scholar to deeply studying the language's meaning as well. Okay, yep, that's an interesting one. And again, that comes up in that little phonetic symbolism. And I know it's a difficult one. I know it sort of comes around in circles. It's not a nice sort of well-structured essay with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a clear line of argument, going through it. It's all over the place, actually. He's clearly, as I was saying last week, thinking with his pen and going in circles, as you do when you first start thinking about a topic. But if you can bear with that, it really repays, second and third and even fourth reading, because there's all sorts of ideas that come out of that essay. It's very rich in terms of that. But he's talking, for example, about this attraction of learning dead language at the point where you still don't understand everything about it, but it is the character, the sounds that carry you and get you hooked. And he also talks about sometimes, what we think is aesthetic is really familiarity. Why we think that the Our Father, the Pater Noster, is, the language is so particularly aesthetically pleasing. He says, well, it's of course because we know so well, and we think that these are instinctive associations, but all they are familiarity. So again, he has a very he's very clear about the limitation of how far he can go philosophically, in terms of the philosophy of language with those ideas. But yeah, definitely, I think what he's trying to capture here is that the original attraction will be that phonetic predilection that I was talking about last week, the character of the language, its particular identity in terms of sounds, in terms of musicality, and of course, yeah, then the meaning is important too. It might be subordinate to sound, but it has to mean something. And of course, for Tolkien, that is another big chapter. Lexicography, multiple meanings, recovered meanings, all of those things that lead to a number of inventions, really, in his legendarium. There's another question by Marie here that G.K. Chesterton's moorcock is mentioned in fairy stories, right? Yes, absolutely it is. So this idea of turning something upside down and making it unfamiliar and fresh and new. It's the same thing, but you just look at it from a different angle and it becomes, something different. So coffee room, the other way around is moorcock. And the other word that comes both in the notes of Tolkien's and in Secret Advice is this word scratch, whatever you pronounce it, which is taking an English word and reversing it phonetically, and then it sounds so alien. Although it is the combination of the sounds that sound alien. The sounds are native, but the way they're combined is not what the language usually allows, and that's enough, to make something strange, to defamiliarize it for the audience. Yeah.
He also quotes abracadabra, doesn't he, as well? That's another word that, that abracadabra,
that was another
which,
little...
again, we're not quite sure what it means, but yeah, it has that kind of connotation of magic and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Language and magic. And that was another little surprise there for us, wasn't it? I did not expect to see abracadabra. Especially Tolkien's views about magic in the essay, but of course it is it is a word or a phrase, whatever we call it, with a very long tradition and a lot of speculation about where it comes from. Definitely, yeah.
Weren't we going to include a note about Weren't we going to include a note about abracadabra and J.K. Rowling and everything? Did that get in? I can't remember.
Yeah, and we didn't. Yeah, I think it was there. That's true, Andy. It was there in the original version, in the first submitted version of our draft to HarperCollins, and that's when we then went back and thought, well, we're really sort of straying away a little bit there from keeping it strict, about Tolkien. Let's forget about that. But we were talking about Avada Kedavra as a sort of as a legacy, a sort of linguistic legacy of abracadabra and its origins. Maybe we should do a little blog about that abracadabra word. I'm just wondering, because we did all the work. It just we decided not to put it in eventually.
The early version. Anything else? I don't see any more.
Yeah, I hope I've gone through everything. I don't know if you can see anything else. And if you've added a question that we haven't addressed and we've sort of missed it right at the beginning, feel free to repost it, because as I said, this is a slightly newer platform, so I might have missed things here, right? I wouldn't trust myself. I hope I've addressed mostly, what you've been asking. Yeah.
That's great. I don't see anything else either just now. But thank you guys so much. It's so much fun thinking through this stuff and learning to just to kind of understand Tolkien. I mean, I was talking about this a lot when we were discussing the Llamas and the Lost Road class, about how foreign to me it always was hearing. I knew that Tolkien said that all of his stories begin with his languages and his language creation, but I could never really wrap my mind and my imagination around that, to really because I'm just not that way. And so trying to understand this guy JRR Tolkien from like an anthropological standpoint, to try to begin to understand what language was and what language meant to him, and I consider it so important to try to understand that in order to really begin to be able to kind of read Tolkien stories better and understand how he worked. And so I just wanted to thank you guys again, not just for your appearance here and your discussions in this seminar series, but for your work on the book. I think your book is such a wonderful tool for helping people to understand all of these things a little bit better. It's such a wonderful insight into sort of Tolkien and his world of language. So thank you guys again, both for the lectures and for the book as well.
That's a lovely thing to say. Sometimes you sort of feel that it's only you who's interested in these things. Who else will want to read about with this. So it's lovely to hear that people are engaging with it and appreciating it. And as Andy was saying, there's a number of online discussions going on about the book, and that is really lovely. It really is. It makes a heck of a difference. It does.
There's a lot to dig into, so go ahead and dig into it.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you again very much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and for those of you who have been listening in asynchronously at home. And I hope you will join us. We are planning, as I said, a series of other seminars. We're going to be joined by Tom Shippey, who's going to be doing a series on Tolkien's Beowulf, looking at the Beowulf translation that was recently published, along with, frankly, my favorite part of that book is Tolkien's notes on the text, even better for my money than the translation itself. So it would be really interesting to hear sort of Tom Shippey walk us through Tolkien's Beowulf material there. We have Verlin Flieger, who of course has been very active lately, publishing not only Kullervo last year, but the forthcoming Leaveo True and Itrun. And she is planning a seminar series which she is titling Tolkien Dark, looking at both of those works, both Kullervo and the Leaveo True and Itrun, looking at this sort of these early dark works that Tolkien wrote, which are so very different from what a lot of people associate with Tolkien. So that's going to be really neat. So keep an eye out for we'll be announcing the exact dates and times of these future seminars. But again, thanks again to you, Dr. Higgins and Dr. Fimi, for starting everything off so wonderfully this month with this series.
Thank you for having us. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this seminar, please consider making a small donation to Signum University. Your gift will help us continue to make the seminar series and other great content available for free to the public. Just go to signumuniversity.org/fund/donate/seminars. Thanks!